Thank you everyone for joining us today for our session on classroom evaluation and research. I'd like to just start off the session by acknowledging where I'm seated. So my name is Trish Souza. My ancestors come from Portugal, specifically from the Azorian Islands. And I want to honor the existence of the first people from the land where I'm presenting and sharing with you today, which is the land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, in the place that we know as Vancouver. And I've lived in Vancouver for about 8 years, and I've just learned so much from the land, from the people here. It's given me such a chance to grow and learn about myself and about others. And I'm committed to learning more as much as I can while I'm in Vancouver, and just continuing to learn and to respect this land. I also want to acknowledge that many of you may not be in Vancouver today, and just give you a chance to honor and respect the land that you're joining us from. So just to give you an overview of today's session. Introduce myself, Trish, and co-facilitator Bruce, and we're joining you from the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I'm going to spend a minute just talking about our goals for today, what we'll be covering. In the first part, we'll be talking about what the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is and how that relates to the presentation today. We'll be walking you through what we call to BREB or not to BREB, considering whether you need to apply for BREB approval, BREB being the Behavioural Research and Ethics Board here at UBC. And then in part two, we'll spend some time talking about being ethical, regardless of whether the work you're doing qualifies as evaluation or research, and specifically working with students and some considerations. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end to answer your questions. My colleague Bruce will be monitoring the chat, so if anything comes up while we're talking, please feel free to type it in the chat. Perhaps we'll cover it in the session, but otherwise we'll flag them as things to discuss at the end. Awesome. Okay, so our main goals for today's workshop are to help you gain more clarity around whether BREB approval is required for your particular project, inquiry, or context, and to guide you on where you need to go to get further assistance, and some tips around that general process. A question that often comes up for us is whether ethics approval is needed, and whether what you're doing has that sort of implication. And so we really want to spend time thinking about that, and really just most importantly reminding you that everything is contextual. What you're doing, each project has its own motives and framework and design. And so we'll offer you some tips here today that hopefully are some guidelines that you can reflect back on, but we always invite you to connect with us as well as the BREB office to get further clarity for your specific project if things continue to be a little bit confusing, as they often do. Okay, so I just want to highlight some of the main goals of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and our objectives. So my colleague Bruce and I both work within the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And the importance of that is that we often get questions about, do I need to go through the BREB application process? Do I need BREB approval? Is my work considered research or evaluation? And those questions come up because we work at a university. And so there's sort of this fine line of anytime you're doing something in the classroom, something teaching and learning related, asking yourself whether it's research or evaluation. And so I wanted to highlight the main objectives of SoTL because they really relate to figuring out where your work sits. So the three main objectives are to enhance student learning through engaging teaching practices, conducting a scholarly examination within the classroom, or asking questions, collecting evidence for different effective teaching methods, and making the results of that analysis publicly available through conference presentations, sharing internally with your own department, or a formal publication. Okay, so with all of that in mind, and thinking, many of you are here today because you're doing, or you've done, or you're thinking about doing some kind of inquiry in a teaching or learning context. what requires you to go through BREB approval. And so one of the main pieces where we see this sort of gray area is in this listing of an activity that doesn't require BREB review. And we often use the word evaluation, but you'll see kind of interchangeably also quality assurance or quality improvement, QA, QI. Evaluation are sort of used interchangeably. And so something that doesn't require BREB review is quality assurance studies, program evaluation or performance reviews, or any sort of testing within a normal educational requirements that are used exclusively for assessment, management, or improvement purposes. And as I was saying, where Bruce and I sit in the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, we see a lot of work within this domain. And a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the projects that we assist with don't need to go through the BREB application process. But oftentimes we see projects where something gets started and then somewhere along the way, there sort of turns into this, like, something more interesting happens and there's a little bit more of a research intent that happens. And so even when you're reading this, you might think, oh, you know, I'm just interested in something that's happening in my classroom. It's evaluation, it's quality assurance. But the conversation we want to have with you today is about really taking time at the start of your project to think about what your intent behind the project is and where things might go. So making decisions beforehand and how to determine, you know, what the real intent is, even if it's something that's happening within the classroom. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a table that was put together by some members, graduate students that worked with us at the Institute for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning a few years ago. They put this together with the BREB office, so in consultation with them, based on some guidelines that the BREB office had provided. So Bruce is going to share with you in the chat this checklist that's provided by the BREB office that is available online, as well as a link to the table that I'm going to talk to you about. And I think both pieces really align quite nicely together. BREB office checklist is put together by the BREB office, who is the ultimate, you know, in control of this decision. But the table that I'm going to be sharing with you and walking you through is something that we put together because we work specifically with teaching and evaluation, teaching and learning projects. And so our context is very specific. And so the table really just walks through helping you consider what your intent behind the project is, whether it's research or evaluation, whether you need to go through that BREB approval process or not, in the context of teaching and learning projects. So I will show you the table here. This is quite small, I recognize. I'm going to walk through each of these points in detail, but I just wanted to show you what it looks like. So this is what we have, the link that Bruce shared from the iSoTL website that really helps categorize for each of these 6 points, whether you're thinking about this as research or as evaluation. And so I'm going to walk through each of these with you now. So this is the one that we kind of think about as a really important first step, and that the BREB office constantly comes back to us. You know, if we have questions or concerns, you know, they always ask, what is your primary intent? What is the goal of the work that you're doing? How are you thinking about the work that you're doing? And so when something is considered evaluation, it's associated with the outcomes of the practice, improving teaching and learning, and it's really limited to the scope of the project that you're currently doing. So you're conducting a project in your Chem 101 course, and you're really interested in, you know, how this new learning tool is impacting your students. You're not considering, or you don't have the intention to consider how other students might be impacted by this learning tool, or how it might generalize to other chemistry contexts or beyond the classroom itself. You're really focused, the scope is really within this one place. On the flip side, when you're looking at research, you're thinking more broadly. So, you know, you've implemented this teaching tool, but you really you're using the tool because, you know, you've read all this literature, there's a theoretical background on the tool itself, and you want to build on that theoretical literature. So you're adding to an existing body of knowledge, or uncovering something new related to it. And the scope is much broader. So you're not only interested in your classroom, perhaps that's where the testing is occurring for now, but you're really interested in the wider implications. I'm using this chemistry classroom as a specific example here, but please insert your own context. But just the idea that that things are much wider, or have a broader application is the real difference here. One thing that I should point out and that I wanted to highlight is that even if going into a project you don't have a research intent, you might think, okay, I'm only interested in my Chem 101 students. There's nothing else, I don't know any of the theory or the background of this project or of other practices relating to it. But then you collect some data and you think, oh, you know what, actually, there's something bigger happening here. Something really interesting is happening. There's no such thing as retroactive BREB approval. So you can't go back and turn that into a research project. What you can do is treat it as a pilot to help you gain some understanding and some knowledge. But what you must do as soon as that research tingling starts happening is apply for BREB approval for any ongoing work that has that research intent. Okay, so in the next part, we linked together two of the blocks on that table that we had, thinking about the role of theory and the role of context, because they are quite related. And when we think about evaluation, the idea is that the research question isn't necessarily built off of a particular theory, and that the focus is more on understanding sort of best practices or what's happening in your classroom context. The goal is really to improve your own teaching. With research, on the other hand, theory is really integrated into the write-up and the analysis. You're thinking about this theory beforehand, and your goal is to conduct this project and then generalize those results beyond your specific classroom or your specific project. So you're comparing it across context. You're not just saying, okay, in my classroom, this is happening. You're thinking about, okay, how does this apply to students at large? And the idea being that with evaluation, again, it's not to say that you can never talk about theory, or that, in a conclusion, you could bring up how it might relate to other literature, but it's not the guiding piece behind your work. You're not building on a theory in the project that you're investigating. Okay. So next, again, combining two pieces here about expectations of students and the practices that are occurring. These two pieces, again, really overlapping. And so the point behind these two items is to really think about what the impact is on your students and what's occurring. So with evaluation, typically the project is taking place in your classroom within classroom time and classroom expectations. So students are expected to do something above and beyond what they would typically do in a classroom. So comparisons might be done on an aggregate level, so you're not necessarily looking at a student by student or a student over time. So some examples of what this would look like would be doing something like a focus group or an interview or a survey on their experience with the classroom or with a teaching practice that's occurring. With research, it often goes beyond classroom expectations. So looking at something that has more of an experimental design where you're splitting the data to look at a comparison between two groups, where one group of students perhaps undergoes a certain intervention or has access to a learning tool and the other group doesn't, and doing that type of comparison. Specifically with this, you want to think about whether one of the groups of students or any students might be put at a disadvantage. And this really comes back to the idea of an experimental design where one subgroup is undergoing one piece, they have access to this tool or this website, and the other group doesn't. And thinking about the impact that can have on students is really important as well. Later on in the presentation, Bruce will talk about some ethical considerations. So regardless of whether you're doing research or evaluation, making sure that student groups are treated equally, or students across the course are treated equally. And lastly, thinking about whether you plan to publish your results. So with evaluation, typically any publication would be in an evaluation journal or a conference. So often within the scholarship of teaching and learning literature, and it's really reflecting on that project. So again, going back to that intent, really focusing on the context, the one specific context in which you conducted the work. A lot of people, we've had people come with questions saying, well, you know, I want to be able to share my work, or I want to publish, and so therefore I have to go through the BREB approval process. And that's not the case at all. In fact, the BREB office is very clear that they don't just want everyone to apply for BREB approval unless your work is considered research. And so these were I recently interacted with the BREB office, and this was their specific guidance around this, was that if a journal, you go through, so you've done an evaluation in your course, a journal asks if you've received institutional research ethics, it's fine to say no, and you just want to clarify that based on the Canadian policy framework, the activities, the evaluation or quality assurance activities didn't require institutional ethics review. Again, though, it's your responsibility to make sure that that's true, that the work that you've done is considered evaluation or quality assurance, and that's the goal of the work that you're doing. But BREB office approval isn't required for you to be able to publish. It's, again, what the intent behind the work is that really matters. And then, on the other hand, with research, publishing is often one of the driving goals because, again, you're often thinking about expanding on a theoretical literature, or you've done some kind of experimental design, and so that type of dissemination is quite important. Oftentimes those publications come within one's own discipline, so for example, an experimental psychology journal, and it's really designed to build off of existing literature, so kind of motivated within a very specific theoretical context. Just want to, coming back to this, the earlier point about whether even if you want to publish something that's considered evaluation, whether it needs BREB approval or not, if it's evaluation, and so you don't need to go through that process, it's really important that you don't frame any of your work as research to participants or any publications, because you haven't gone through the BREB application approval process, the BREB approval process. You really want to set it up as being evaluation and not imply that it's research, because research, saying that it's research does require BREB approval. So just being really clear in your intent and the way that you talk about the work that you're doing. So we're just going to take a break here, finishing up part one before Bruce takes over. And I just want to check in with Bruce if there are any questions in the chat or anything we want to discuss.
Thank you, Trish. If we could start with Jim, because I think he had a question earlier, and then maybe we address Gabriel's concern about publishing, whether you just do a pilot, a study, then and you see the material relevant. So Jim, please turn on the mic and.
Sure. I have a specific scenario. Maybe you could help me whether I need to do BREB. So I've been doing a course for 10 years, have 10 years of peer evaluation data from the teamwork part of that course. And I've just become intrigued to look at gender bias in peer evaluation. Can I do that and publish the results? Because I can't retroactively go back 10 years and get students' permission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great question and a great point. I think I want to talk just quickly about the last sentence that you said about retroactive. So again, highlighting the importance for new projects, really thinking about that intent coming in, because retroactive BREB not possible retroactive consent for using old data, also very difficult to obtain. Who knows where those students are now? So thanks for speaking to that specifically. I think I'll speak to this first, and then Bruce, if you have anything to chime in. I think the important thing for your example, Jim, would be, my question would be, why are you interested in gender bias, and sort of where did that question come from? And if it's driven by something, theoretical or in the literature, there's this research piece about it, about, X, Y, and Z theories talk about these differences in gender, that gender bias exists, and your goal is to review the data that you have to speak to that. To me, that feels like more of a research intent. Whereas if the goal is more around evaluating where those differences exist, given the data that you have, to enhance the teaching that you're doing or to change the teaching that you're doing in your classroom context, then I'd say that sits more in evaluation. Bruce, do you have thoughts, anything to add?
Yeah, if I may, there's a question about actually clear boundaries between evaluation and research. And I think if you have a question that you're interested in, you're starting with SoTL. The boundaries are not very clear, as somebody just mentioned in the chat. There are specific practices that I was going to talk about, and maybe we could have a general discussion after I've gone through this, that will help you to kind of consider why you're doing what you're doing and how you should proceed, regardless whether you need to obtain BREB or no. We do recommend a sort of a standard that you follow that ensures that the integrity of the participants are held. Obtaining BREB does not necessarily means that you are ethical. The other consideration that we encourage you to think about is the very notion of the participant means that the students that you're working with, they're not simply data. They're participants. They're helping you to conduct a process. So being transparent to those people that they're helping you, whether you proceed with publication or no, about the aims of why you're doing this is an initial step to think about research and evaluation as a whole. So the whole conversation about the BREB that we're having today is not to make recommendations. Those recommendations come from the BREB office. Trish and I are talking about the processes and consideration that we hope that you start with before you start a research or an evaluation project, considering the participants that you have.
So are you saying that 10 years ago, I should have said, probably 7 or 8 years from now, I'm going to start seeing patterns in the data around gender that I might ask a question about? Like how could I possibly predict the patterns that are going to fall out of aggregate data years to come from, because it will flow back to the improvement of the course.
Of course.
But isn't it interesting that after 10 years, I've noticed a pattern, I've done the stats, and I do see this gender bias. What do I do? What do I do with that thing I found? Because it doesn't sound like I can publish it.
Jim, I see your concern, and the personal intent is a key to start processes with those that you worked with. And if you don't see any risk in this, I suggest that you contact the BREB office and actually seek out their views on this. Because again, if there's a conflict of interest in using that data that we, as people who do a scholarship of teaching and learning, do not perceive, we don't want to be the people to tell you whether you can publish or no. I would say you contact the organizing body at UBC and get their feedback on this. But you could also decide that I will go ahead and publish, and you assess the risk to the participants yourself. So I'm not advising a course of action here. And Adriana, my colleague here, has a comment also for this.
I do have a comment. Thank you, Jim. There's such thing as applying through BREB for secondary use of data. And I think that may be something that applies to your case. It depends on the fine grain of the data that I think that would dictate whether BREB would approve the procedure or not. And again, as Bruce says, we are not the body to actually say where that boundary rests. So absolutely, the recommendation is to reach out to the BREB office. And but there is such a thing as, applying for secondary use of data. So they will have raise some questions. There's a section in the application that speaks to that part. And so it will be up to them to really just tease out the details of your request. But it is possible to use historical data as long as, it's aggregate data, there's no identifiable information. They will have questions around consent, and maybe the answer is what you just shared, 7, 8 years ago, I didn't know. So there's no consent in place. So I think it just needs to be a transparent conversation, and it will be up to them to give a green light or not to your request of use of data. But there is a process in place for secondary use of data, and that's something I think you should explore with them.
Thank you, Adriana. So if it's okay, I actually enjoyed this conversation more than going through the slides, but I was hoping to talk about the slides that we have left, and there's only 3 left. And then we could have a general discussion with you here, because we're also very interested in your experience. So I want to allow enough time at the end. So for people who want to talk with us, they have this opportunity to ask their question. And I know there were a couple of comments in the chat box that I hope that you actually elaborate a little bit more, and we could have a talk in about 10 minutes after I go through the next 3 slides. I hope that's okay with everyone. So Trish, if you may, yes, and thanks, Bam. Thanks for being here with us today, and have a good day. So as I mentioned, having a BREB approval is not necessarily means that you're being ethical. And being ethical, we frame that in very broad terms, considering your methodology, considering your interaction with the students, and considering the scholarly conduct responsibilities that are put forward, that I will share shortly with you. So I'm going to make some general recommendation that we perceive that they're best practices. And you still, if you uphold these practices, you go ahead with your evaluation and you do your publications. So although BREB office acts as an institutional body to uphold ethical consideration, having approval from BREB is a beginning to consider issues of risk and integrity to your participants. Next slide, please. And that begins by making sure you clearly inform students of your intention by sharing via consent of why you're collecting data from them, what data you will be using and how, and where the data will be kept and who has access to it, and how their data will be kept confidential and private. By sharing this information, the students or actually know that what you're doing is make improvement in progress, make improvement to your pedagogy, and they're more likely to participate in your study, feeling that what you're doing is benefiting other people rather than just yourself. So there's a degree of transparency in the processes that helps everybody. And I'm going to share the link. Thank you, Adriana. I was going to share the link about the resources that we have developed where you can use to put a consent form together. And this is just the beginning for you to consider the context that it actually applies. Whether you're doing surveys or focus group or interviews, we have examples here, as I have shared, for recruiting participants and obtaining their consent. Next slide, please. Thank you. So please consider explaining to participants how their data will be confidential. And there are cases like conducting the focus group where their identity is not kept confidential because there are 4 other participants in that study. So explaining the logistics to your participants will be very helpful. if you have a TA that will be distributing the surveys and will just provide the instructor with anonymous set of data, then it's good for students to know this. And so they will give you more honest feedback in these cases. Storing student information securely is an important issue here, considering the privacy issues. And we do recommend MS Team right now and OneDrive. We're phasing out the previous workspace that UBC was using. So if you have any data there, we highly recommend that you move your data to MS Teams. And the BREB office has a new set of rules for us to follow during the COVID pandemic that we highly recommend you to follow. And I will share the links again in the chat box. So these are some consideration that you might review before contacting your students at the given context. Next slide, please. We do recommend to refrain from collecting personal information. Yes, we'll send the slides at the end. Thank you for asking that. There should be mailed to you. So we highly recommend that you do not collect personal information as much as you can, and consider the dilemmas around incentives. For example, no incentives for a long period of data collection may result in having few participants. Big incentives could actually impact the kind of data that you're collecting. There are some examples of what makes sense. Maybe a raffle makes sense. Maybe providing a small gift cards would make sense in this context. The other way to go about evaluations usually is to provide opportunities for students, for all the students to be included in providing feedback. So again, it goes back to the methodologies and the design of your study. So much of what we talk about in evaluation research is sort of a holistic approach that needs to be taught through, and probably is best when you have conversation with other people beforehand. Next slide, please. And I would like to bring your attention to the UBC scholarly integrity policies that are in place. The language of a scholarly conduct seems to be informative to adopt best practices that university has in place to protect the dignity of the individuals. And they are relevant whether you're conducting a research or an evaluation. So I will share the couple of links. The first one is a link to the website, and the second one is actually a link to the actual policy document that may help you to consider the issues of conflict of interest, power relationship, being inclusive to all the participants that you have, fairness and representation of the results and who will get it. In some studies, we do suggest that if you're allowed, you could share the final result with your students and really engage them in the conversations afterwards. Again, explaining to your students that they're participating in the research is voluntary. It's something that you should absolutely highlight. Again, regardless whether you obtain BREB or no. And in the links that I've shared, there's also issues around authorship and intellectual contribution that we hope you consider. And I think, is that it, Trish? Have I left anything out? And is this the last slide? Yes, this is a thank you. So if I haven't, Trish and Adriana, if there's something else that you want to comment, please go ahead. But there were a couple of questions in the chat box that I hope that we get to.
Yeah, all good for me, Bruce. I think let's use the rest of the time to go back to those questions. And if anyone has further questions, please type them in the chat and we'll work through those. And I just wanted to verbalize, we will be sharing, you'll get an email from the events team with a copy of the slides and a recording of the presentation. So you'll have access to all those pieces.
Thank you. So can we start with Gabriel?
Yeah, let me go back to her question.
And I think Tamara, I see a hand raising up. So Dr. Lam, did you have a comment that you want to make?
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. This was super helpful. And also all the resources too. I was just able to relate to when Trish was mentioning kind of this pivot, or not this pivot, but a transition from treating the work in the study as evaluation all the way to a research study. And I was wondering what the implications of considering that work as a pilot study, what the implications are. And any implications about publishing or sharing this work with other people and comparing it with future work as well, or information.
Yeah, so I think if the project, and from the sense that I got, and I remember an earlier discussion we had about this, Gabby, the project kind of starts off as an evaluation. You're doing this work, and then you realize, like, oh, you know what, there's something bigger happening here. I want to see how this relates to the literature and kind of make it more of a research project. I think it's fine to publish that first piece as evaluation, which is what the intent of that work was. So sharing, this is what I found within my own context. That's a great place where in a discussion section, or a future directions part of an art, if it was an article, for example, or a presentation, next steps we want to do is see how this relates to X, Y, and Z theory, or how it might broadly apply to these different contexts. Showing that transition of like, okay, you know what, something is happening here that's bigger than I thought. I want to make this a research project. I think that's completely fine. The issue or the question around being able to use that data to compare, I think it's a little bit more complicated. Because again, it depends on what the intent is that you shared with participants about how that data will be. So, if participants had been told, the data that we're collecting, we want to look at it longitudinally, and we plan to make comparisons. So students are already informed of how their data would be used, then that would be fine. If the data is then, or if alternatively, the data is being used in a different way than the initial intent, I think that's the case again, like what Adriana brought up, is connecting with the BREB office about looking at using that as secondary data. So using what I call here is your pilot data, your initial evaluation data as secondary data. So being able to use that data that you've already collected for any type of future research going on. Adriana, Bruce, other thoughts or concerns? Does that help, Gabby? I hopefully I answered.
It does. It does. Thanks, Trish. And then the two contacts that were provided, Maria Vallant and Jane Ruiz, those are contacts at BREB, right? Is ORE the same as BREB?
Yeah, so the Office of Research Ethics is sort of the like overarching UBC body. My institutional language is poor today. And then the BREB office is, so the research ethics is sort of like all research that happens. Animal research, clinical testing, everything. BREB is the behavioral research. So that's because we work with students typically, or it's fellow instructors or teaching teams. The ethics approval board that we go through is the BREB office. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. I'm just scrolling through the chat to see.
Tamara had her hands up, and
yeah. Please go ahead, Tamara.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation and for providing resources. I may be a minority in this, so forgive my lack of knowledge of a lot of this. I'm not a PhD. I didn't come through a research background. I'm a lecturer. I've been with UBC. This is, I can't recall if this is my 12th or 13th year, so I've been here for some time. I appreciate the value of research and ethics for sure, and research and all that those of you do from a research perspective. But I have 2 points that I'm curious on that I see more commonly, that I think is happening fairly commonly across without, when I think about a lecturer or a sessional or an adjunct, I don't know if it's as clear, all of these. I don't know how many people on this session today, for instance, come from a background like this and don't actually come from a research background, and maybe there are more than I'm aware. But one of there are two very divergent pieces I want to raise here. One is, as an instructor, sometimes for for teaching and learning conferences, as an example, I was asked to somebody was aware of something that I had implemented in my classroom for sort of a different type of peer evaluation that I had allowed for my students to be able to do instead of the sort of the traditional. And I was asked to speak on that for that as a conference. That had never, nor was I aware of research ethics, all of that. So I'm curious whether something like that sometimes oversteps the lines on this, and or whether those types of things, you're just speaking at a conference to sort of share what you've implemented in your classroom, or what a tool is that you've designed in your classroom, without going into the detail of any of the respondent components to that, just sharing sort of something. I saw that more as subtle, but I'm wondering now if maybe where we start crossing that line, and it opens up the whole discussion around, do we have a lot of me in our system across all of the campuses that maybe aren't even aware? So that's one of the pieces I'm curious on. Where is that gray line, and when do we start crossing it, and how do we get the communication out there more if we are crossing that? And the very other side of that, I do know colleagues, some are research colleagues, some are not, who have their students do, as part of their projects, whether it be a large term project or a team project or whatever it may be, the students are doing surveys out in the community and using that toward their toward what they are using as I guess their data for their projects. And it's always been curious to me, shouldn't that be undertaken with some research ethics oversight on that? And sometimes, not always, sometimes that is those courses or those certain projects are being supervised by, or are in a course where a research intensive faculty member may be teaching that course, but oftentimes they're not. So it raises another, it's all kind of in the same zone of, do we have many of us out there who are maybe doing things that are crossing lines without being aware that we're crossing lines? Are we crossing lines? I've always been hesitant to do. I did take the Tri-Council REB training a few years ago, and it was interesting to me, and it really made me question what I know that some people are doing. And I purposely don't do those types of things in my classroom. And I rethink when people ask me to speak at a session, at a learning conference, for instance. I think, I don't know that I'm even allowed to share some of this. So if you could kind of speak to some of those, and either help me understand where those gray lines are, or give me some comfort that I'm just overreacting, or help maybe come up with some ideas of how we get the word out there more, if these are not good things that people might be doing.
So if I may speak to that, I really appreciate that you brought that up. There is a shift that is happening within the sciences to distinguish human sciences as not so objective. And so if you're dealing with the participants that they're human, they should be treated as human. So the issue of privacy is actually something that is not, that we just upheld as something that is, private. It deals with human rights to have access to their own data, for example. This sort of language is going around that really clarifies that in human research, we should consider human relationships, right? And that is something that has escaped us because we have this objective lens to reality that has grown and is slowly coming back into the conversation that we have. That's a theoretical framework that is really hard to get out. But I think the scholarly integrity initiatives that has been put out, and there has been a policy that even I wasn't informed when I started as a PhD student, and that is getting out more and more. And we do encourage people to go to the scholarly integrity policies that I have just posted, because it really clarifies whether you could just survey your students and use that class time and their efforts regularly just for the sake of improvement. Everybody could approach the notion of the improvement from their own subjective view, not necessarily considering the precautions of the time of the students that they're engaging in and spending into it. So I think that the boundaries in between what is consider an evaluation, what is an actual research, is continuously evolving. But our attention to working with humans for students who pay, for example, to be part of research, how we share those data in the context that we do it, does it protect their integrity, does reduce its risk to them, then I would say the conversation in the conferences are normal conversations. But maybe if you're conducting surveys every 5 days on your students, there is something that to be personally concerned about their time and the time of the pedagogy that it needs to be going to students regularly. But again, we're not policing everybody, and that's not the purpose of it, is to start a conversation to be more humane towards human. And I think that's really what ethics is about. And, you know, there's different philosophical framework that you could say, I'm a utilitarian and the greater good will justify why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? And there are other frameworks more within the caring ethics that has been recently explained. And those frameworks really help you to consider the impact of what you're doing to the people. And this is really a personal work. The guidelines will get us only so far to talk about things, you know. So we hope that we encourage some of that reflection today. Without going too far, I saw a couple of hands and maybe.
And I just add something really quick, Bruce, to Tamara's second question about the course. There's a specific type of BREB that is for course activities. So if you or your colleagues are engaging, you know, are asking students to conduct interviews, engage with community members, or even interviewing students among themselves, that kind of thing that is for pedagogical purposes, there's a specific type of BREB that will clear that activity. And it should, I think my suggestion would be to explore that option. Other than that, I agree, the conference conversation is totally fine as long as there's no identified information shared, you know, student names, that kind of thing. Being really mindful as to how you share things should be okay.
Thank you. Catherine, please.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I think actually Tamara's questions and your responses really addressed a lot of what I was thinking about. But I did have a question from earlier in the chat, because I'm in the Faculty of Education. I feel like myself and many of my ed leadership colleagues were kind of always inquiring into our teaching practice and how that's working. And so I think some of us wonder if to leave open the potential to ever share that in a conference space or a publication, like, is the practice to kind of just always have a BREB going to make sure that we're, you know, sort of covering our bases. So that's one question in education specifically. But the second question is, I know, was it Jim a while back asked a question about this past data, and it seemed that most of the answers related to kind of quantitative survey result type things. But I wondered if anybody had experience wanting to look back at more qualitative, like written assignments or things like that, and if anyone knew if the same principle about secondary data applied. So those are my two questions.
Can I go ahead, Bruce? Do you want me to answer?
Go ahead.
I saw you unmute yourself, so I don't want to jump again. Yeah, thanks for that, Catherine. The qualitative quantitative piece isn't an issue. Like, it's not an issue in terms of the way data is considered. You want to treat both equally in terms of respecting student privacy and that conflict of interest that could occur. I gotta, just to go back then to your first question around whether you should just go through the BREB approval process regardless, I'd say don't. I think that part of us designing that table for the Institute for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and conversations we've had is that early on, that was sort of our process. We'll just send everything to the BREB office and they can decide. And in cases where it's clear evaluation, we really want to avoid going through that process, both in terms of your own time and their time. They're trying to build these sort of clearer standings, clearer guidelines of when something is evaluation and when it's research. Because if your intention is not research and there's you know, those pieces aren't there, then going through that application process doesn't make sense. And they'll ask you, they'll say, well, is there research intent here? Where is your research intent? And if it's not there, then don't come to us. I think the bigger piece that I want to go back to that Bruce brought up earlier is really this idea of student consent and being clear with your students on how the data might be used, what the data is being used for. And this is a question that a couple people have asked about, or I've seen a couple of mentions in the chat about how to use student data or what to do with anonymous quotes and things like that. The kind of, I think the big overarching message kind of from part 2 of the session is really being mindful and open and honest with your students about how you're going to use any data that's collected for evaluation purposes or for research purposes. So even if you don't go through, and you don't need to go through the BREB application process, still asking students or letting students know how their data will be used, what their data will be used for, that's really what's most important. So you can use anonymous student quotes for evaluation so long as you're being clear to your students and you're upfront with your students that you're going to use that data. You know, I'm collecting this survey data about your experience with this tool. You know, in the future, I might share your responses at a conference or an evaluation journal. Letting students know how the data is being used, that's what's really important, regardless of whether it's research, regardless of whether it's evaluation, and thinking through that intent of what you might want to use that data for. I think that's really what's ultimately important, is being clear with what you're going to do with the data and you know, what analyses do you have planned? If you have these analyses planned, you know, you have an intention of where that data is going to go. Bruce, anything to chime in on?
No, that was good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Jim had a question about, should we BREB in case the data becomes interesting in years to come? Again, I don't think interesting is a way that research or evaluation proceed in collecting data. I think there are methodological issues, whether you're evaluating or you're researching, that you should have a research question. You should, it's just exactly like sciences. Like a chemist does not begin to say, can I go ahead and mix these two things and see what happens? They experiment a lot, but they also draw on research methodologies and evaluation methodologies before they go ahead and collect data. And that's very, very central to social research.
One more thing, and I was about to type that, but it may be easier just to share with everyone, is that it will be very hard, I think, to put together a BREB application when there's really no research questions, when there's really no clarity about where things may go or they may become interesting. So I see your point, Jim. It is a tricky thing. So my suggestion, I think the best course of action is, again, getting a student consent, even if no BREB in place, and even if you're starting off as maybe this is just, you know, quality assurance type of thing, or maybe don't even know if that would be useful information for quality assurance. Seeking student consent or just information, right? I'm collecting this piece of data for X or Y purposes. That will take you a long way. If down the years you decide to maybe request, again, secondary use of data, but you have consent in place, that will just take you that much further in terms of accessing the data, being able to use the data once you have actually formulated a research question following, a sound methodological kind of process and such. So yeah, that would be my comment about that question.
So Simon has raised hands, and I saw Yvonne had a comment. So
yeah, so thanks. I just think this conversation is really important on campus right now. And I'm coming at this from the perspective of educational leadership track faculty members that are interested, that are already engaged or are interested in getting engaged in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and educational scholarship generally. So we've been dealing with this issue over in pharmacy. I'm a professor of teaching in pharmaceutical sciences, and been dealing with this exact issue over the last probably year or so. So this issue of whether or not ethics is required has been festering on campus for decades. And I've been dealing it with faculty in pharmacy that want to get into this. I'm continually asked, do I need ethics approval for this? And I think one of the reasons for this is that the Tri-Council policy statement does not, we don't see ourselves in those guidelines. And so it's led to often ambivalence about the requirements for ethics in general. And so people are just thinking, well, it doesn't apply to me, so I don't need to do that. And I think for the sake of developing quality scholarship, regardless of your context, like ethics needs to be part of that. We need to be really engaged in ethics. So my question to the group here, I'd really like to get your sense of this, is that if we're distinguishing between evaluation, QA, QI, and research, what do we actually get to call research? I think that's that's a question that we need to grapple with and come up with some kind of clear guidelines about how to deal with this stuff. So, like, if we're saying, well, the QA QI work is not research, and it's leading us to question whether we should be presenting that, I think we need to push back against that, because what I tell our pharmacy, my pharmacy colleagues over here, is that you need to consider all your scholarship as research, but delineating, for the purposes of publication and presentation between QA, QI, and what is called research. And, it becomes very gray very quickly. But even the distinguishing between QA, QI, like I could say that a lot of the QA, QI work that I do in our faculty is about generating new context-specific knowledge. We've never had that before. So, it's this issue, I think, is really important for us as a stream on campus to really get our heads around. So I'll finish there. Just one thing. I'm working specifically. I put a document together for pharmaceutical sciences. It's on the ORE website. I'm working specifically with ORE for guidelines for dealing with scholarship of teaching and learning, as well as QA QI.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Simon. And yeah, I'm excited I'll Google this right after our session to learn about those guidelines. I think that's great. I think that what you're bringing up is really what was the big motivation for us in developing that table, sitting in with the SoTL work and understanding, how does the way the BREB office talks about things, how does that apply to, scholarship of teaching and learning and the type of teaching and learning work that so many of us do. And yeah, I'm not in the teaching faculty stream, so I don't want to hijack the conversation too much, but I think what you're saying is such an important conversation. And I think a big part of it is that research is seen as being on this golden pedestal, as being, systematic and thorough, and it's the be all and end all, and is what is highly valued at our research intensive university. And I think it's important to really consider that, evaluation work should still be systematic, and we should be going into these projects with clear, distinct questions and being ethical and considering scholarly integrity in all of those practices that we do, and learning how to equate those. But yeah, Simon, I'm mindful of time, and I want to give anyone who wants to chime in a chance to speak to that, because I think you bring up a great point about, how do we learn to value the QA, QI evaluation scholarly work that so many people in the teaching faculty stream are doing.
Yes, I also want to say thank you, Simon, for that contribution. And necessarily, I think evaluations should be published. We're not saying that you cannot publish evaluations or you cannot have conversation with that. As part of this conversation, we say even whether you're doing evaluation or research, you should have a methodology. And again, this policy has been hidden and people not paying attention to the scholarly integrity. And I think the language that they use is not a language whether you should publish or not publish. They have best practices on a scholarly practices that has been previously left out because so many people relied or conceive research as something that has to be processed through the BREB office before they could go ahead, or evaluation as something that I'm just doing an improvement and my personal interest is not involved. I think whether we do research or evaluation, there is a personal interest that is at a stake here. And the scholarly integrity policies that we have, and it's been neglected for so long, they're coming back now and saying that you could do a scholarly practice and these are the best practices to follow. Necessarily, again, getting BREB or no does not mean people are doing good research. A lot of people who do evaluation are doing better work in our views because they actually are, they're hands-on, they're there, they know their classrooms, they really know what's happening with their students. So I appreciate what you just said, and we're defending what you're doing really today. I'm very mindful of time. If you have any questions, please ask. Otherwise, I think we could conclude if there's no comments.
And yeah, just a reminder, we'll be sharing the slides and a recording, and please do feel free to reach out to myself or Bruce with any context-specific questions that you have, and ultimately the BREB office, if that gray area still remains. Thank you all for joining us.